we are in the energy transport part of transport phenomena. We have derived the integral energy balance equation starting from the first law of thermodynamics and looked at applications, and now we will derive the differential form of the energy balance equation and also discuss the Fourier's law of heat conduction and look at applications of the differential energy balance equation, and those are the terms that are highlighted here: energy balance, within that differential balance, and Fourier's law, and then in applications differential balance equations. So, what is the outline for differential energy balance equation? We will start with the chemical engineering applications of differential energy balance equation as applied to heat transfer equipments, mass transfer equipments and reactors. Then we start deriving the differential energy balance equation. It goes through a series of stages. First, we derive in terms of the total energy, that is internal, kinetic and potential energy put together. From that we get an equation in terms of internal and kinetic energy. Then we derive a separate differential energy balance equation for kinetic energy starting from the linear momentum balance equation, and then with the last two equations we can get an equation for the internal energy, and from the differential energy balance equation for internal energy using thermodynamic relationship we express in terms of enthalpy and then temperature. We discussed the Fourier's law of heat conduction. We also simplify the differential energy balance equation to forms which are usually used, and finally look at application of the differential energy balance equation. The main application is to find out the temperature profile. So, we find the temperature profile in a slab, extend that to a furnace wall, and then we find temperature profile in planar cuvette flow. Now, we are going to start with the applications of differential energy balance equation, and that is why this bullet is highlighted. Before discussing differential linear momentum balance equation, we discussed the chemical engineering applications of the differential linear momentum balance equation along with the continuity equation. So, similarly here we will discuss the chemical engineering applications of differential energy balance equation before starting to derive that, so that we know where is it applied and why do we need a differential energy balance equation. We are going to see the application with respect to heat transfer equipments, mass transfer equipments and reactors. Under heat transfer equipments we are going to look at heating of fluid flowing through a pipe, heat exchanger and then micro channel heat sink. Under mass transfer equipments we will discuss the application of and the energy balance to a packed bed absorber and then membrane distillation. And then for reactors we should also know that the main application of the energy balance equation in the chemical engineering literature is for reactors. If you search, let us say, differential energy balance equation, many of the papers which you come across will be application for reactors. So, we will take up a packed bed reactor, a membrane reactor and then a carbon particle. So, let us start with the heat transfer equipments. The first application is shown here. We have a pipe through which water flows. We know the inlet temperature and we need to find out the exit temperature, and this pipe wall is subject to a constant heat flux For example, you can wind with a heating tape which will supply a constant heat flux. So, we can solve the energy balance equation to find out the exit temperature. What is shown here is the temperature profile along the radius of the pipe. So, how do we get? We solve the energy balance equation and get the radial temperature profile, and then we can average this temperature and then also get the variation of the average temperature along the length of the pipe, and that is what is shown here. And you can also get the axial variation of the temperature of the surface of the pipe, and under these conditions the temperature difference between them will remain a constant. And so, we can use energy balance equation to find out the exit temperature given the inlet temperature. The next application is for heat exchangers. Different configurations of heat exchangers are possible, where exchange of heat takes place between a hot fluid and a cold fluid. Two simple configurations are shown here: a co-current heat exchanger and a counter current heat exchanger. In the co-current heat exchanger, both the cold fluid and the hot fluid enter at the left hand side and leave at the right hand side. In the counter current arrangement, they flow in opposite direction. Cold is flowing from right to left and hot is flowing from left to right. Now, we can solve the energy balance equation to find out the temperature profile in these heat exchangers. What is the practical application? You can use the energy balance equation for the design of these heat exchangers. You can predict their performance or use it for the design of these heat exchangers. The next example is a microchannel heat sink, which is used to remove the heat generated in microelectronic equipments, and that is what is shown here. A microprocessor is shown in which heat is generated, and a microchannel heat sink is shown here, and these are the channels through which a fluid is sent. It could be a liquid, could be air, or it could be a nanofluid, which helps to remove the heat that is being generated. We already seen this example when we discussed applications for the linear momentum balance equation. The focus then was on the pressure drop and the velocity profile, but now our objective is on the heat transfer part. The study shown, they have considered a microchannel heat sink of such a geometry where the walls are wavy and the fin is porous. The idea of choosing such a geometry is to enhance the rate of heat removal. Now, suppose we want to design a microchannel heat sink which is very efficient, which means that it should remove heat very quickly, then that performance of the heat sink depends on the temperature profile in the heat sink, and which can be obtained by solving the energy balance equation. Of course, you do have flow, so you solve along with the continuity and the Navier-Stokes equation, and such temperature profiles are shown here at different lengths along the channel. So, you can use the energy balance equation to get the temperature profile and arrive at very efficient design of this microchannel heat sink. Now, let us move on to mass transfer equipments. The first example is an absorber. What is the application? In power plants, we burn coal and generate power, but the flue gas coming from the power plant has lot of CO2 in it. So, it can't be let out to the atmosphere. We will have to capture the CO2 and then let out to the atmosphere. How do you capture is what is shown here. So, the exhaust from the power plant is sent upwards through a absorption column and it is brought in contact with the amine solution, for example monoethanol amine solution, and transfer of CO2 takes place from the gaseous phase to the liquid phase and the relatively clean gas is let out to the atmosphere. What happens to the amine solution? It becomes rich in CO2. We send it to a stripping column which strips off CO2 from the amine solution and it is recycled back to the absorber. Our focus here in this slide is on the absorption column. In the present study, let us say we want to predict the performance of the absorption column. What do we mean by that? Let us say we want to predict the percentage removal of CO2 or we want to design this absorption column for the best removal of CO2, then we need to solve the conservation equations. What are the conservation equations? The energy balance equation and the species balance equation. So, the equations have been solved and the temperature profile along the length of the packed column is predicted and compared with experimental data. Not alone that, in this work they also study how the temperature varies along the length of the column under transient conditions. What happens when you start the plant, what happens when you give a change in gas flow rate or liquid flow rate, and the authors predict how the liquid phase temperature will vary along the length of the column at different time instants. More importantly, our main variable of interest is the percentage removal of CO2. So, the authors also predict how the percentage removal of CO2 varies with time under a startup condition and then when there is step change in gas and liquid flow rate. So, you can use the conservation equations to predict the steady state performance and the dynamic performance of the absorption column. The next example is on distillation, not the conventional distillation, but membrane distillation, which is used to separate water from an aqueous solution, let us say brine solution, and the application would be to get water from sea water, and such application is shown here, which is called as membrane distillation, because we use a membrane to achieve this separation. So, the membrane distillation unit is schematically shown here. Through the feed side we send the, let us say, the brine solution, and the permeate side we send water, and what separates these two sides is a hydrophobic membrane, and the driving force for the operation is the temperature difference between these two streams. The feed stream is at a higher temperature, the water stream is at a lower temperature. So, what happens? In the feed side water vaporizes, it diffuses through the hydrophobic membrane, and when it reaches on the other side it condenses. So, in that way we achieve separation of water from the salt solution, and we use a hydrophobic membrane so that liquid water does not pass through it. And suppose we want to design this membrane distillation unit, study the performance of the membrane distillation unit. What do we mean by that? The main variable of interest here is how much of water has got transferred from the feed side to the permeate side. So, to predict its performance we need to solve the conservation equations. What are the conservation equations? We solve the continuity and Navier-Stokes equation, because you do have flow here, and we solve the energy balance equation to get the temperature profile. Temperature plays a major role, as we have seen, that is a driving force, and because water vapor diffuses through the membrane we solve the species balance also. So, what is shown here are the temperature profiles in the feed side, the permeate side and the membrane as well, and then the concentration of water vapor in the membrane, how does it spatially vary, and more importantly what is the flux of water, how much of water passes through the membrane along the length of the membrane. So, you can solve the conservation equations to predict its performance or arrive at an optimal design. Okay, let us move on to reactors. The first example is a packed bed reactor. The application is for the production of methanol from synthesis gas, for which the flow sheet is shown here. Our focus is on the methanol reactor, and one of the designs is shown here. The feed gas enters here, rises up through the inner tube and then flows down through the annular tube. That is why the title says annular multitubular reactor. We are focusing on one such tube, there are several such tubes in the reactor. So, feed gas enters the inner tube and then flows down through the annular region where we have packed the catalyst. It is a catalytic reaction, and because it is exothermic we use a coolant. Now, to efficiently design this reactor, predict its performance, once again we will have to solve the conservation equations. We solve the energy balance and species balance equations, and in this study the equations have been solved, and the temperature profile in the tube side in the annular region where you have the catalyst bed, they have been predicted, and we can also predict what is the concentration of methanol along the length of the reactor. They have also compared with experimental data. So, once the model is validated, we can use the model to study the effect of different parameters. For example, the authors study what is the effect of pressure on the temperature profile, the methanol concentration profile, so that you can arrive at the optimal operating conditions, and what is the objective, to maximize the production of methanol. So, that is where the conservation equations play a role, in this case energy balance along with the species balance equation. The next example is also a packed bed reactor, but it is a packed bed membrane reactor. The application is for the production of ethylene from natural gas or methane. Methane is sent through the tube side which is packed with a catalyst, and then through the shell side we send oxygen. Oxygen and methane react to give ethylene. Now, the shell side is closed here. So, what happens? Oxygen enters into the tube. How does it enter? The surface of the tube or the walls of the tube is made of an inorganic membrane. So, oxygen diffuses through the membrane and reaches the tube side. So, in that way oxygen is fed to the reactor along the entire length of the reactor. That is why it is called a packed bed membrane reactor. You have a packed bed inside the tube, and then the walls of the tube is made of a membrane, which also plays a role for allowing the oxygen to enter the inside of the tube. Now, to design such a membrane packed bed reactor or to predict its performance, we will have to solve all the 4 conservation equations: continuity, momentum, energy and species equation also. Okay. And in this work, the temperature profile in the reactor, our focus is on the tube inside the tube only. So, the temperature profile in the packed bed is predicted, and what is shown here is the ethylene mole fraction, that is our final variable of interest. So, how does ethylene mole fraction vary in the reactor, that is also shown. The authors predict the temperature profile along the length of the reactor as a function of time as well. So, we use the conservation equations including the energy balance equation to design such reactors and predict their performance. And the last example is not a reactor, but just a single particle which could be inside a reactor. Let us say we have a carbon particle, let us say a few hundred microns, and that is in an atmosphere of oxygen and CO2. So, carbon particle surrounded by oxygen and CO2 of different composition. We want to know what is the rate at which the carbon particle burns, and that is what the objective of this study is. Once again all the conservation equations are solved, all the 4 conservation equations are solved, including the differential energy balance equation, and the authors predict the temperature at the surface of the carbon particle and compare with experimental results. They also predict what is the concentration of CO2 surrounding the particle, what happens at low velocity, what happens at high velocity, and then they consider a porous particle and see what is the temperature distribution inside the particle and what is the temperature distribution outside the particle. So, by solving the energy balance equation, of course along with other conservation equations, we can do a detailed study at even at the particle level. That is why this example is being discussed. Other example were at the scale of a reactor, let us say a few meters, but this is order of few microns, and this where is this carbon particle, of course that could be inside a reactor, and eventually we can predict the performance of the reactor. Okay. So, those are the applications which I would say are high end applications as far as this course is concerned. I would say all of them are research level applications, most of them. What is that we are going to discuss in the present course? As usual, our applications are going to be very simple. Let us look at them. We are going to apply the differential energy balance equation to find out the temperature profile in a slab whose two surfaces are at 2 different temperatures, and then we will extend that to a series of slabs which would represent a furnace wall made of different layers, and here our objective would be to find out the heat flux through such a wall made of different layers, and then we move on to our well known example of the planar cuvette flow, bottom plate fixed, top plate moving, but now with a difference. We will consider the case where the bottom plate and the top plate are at 2 different temperatures. Our objective would be to find out the temperature profile, just like we focused on the velocity profile. Now, we will see how to get the temperature profile between the 2 plates. So, those are the simple applications which we will discuss as part of this course.